I was in Atlanta for a friend's Benot mitzvah celebration, and Rabbi Zupan and I had time for a walk before we had to go to the airport. We happened upon a group of young demonstrators holding signs. One of the signs read, "Queers for Palestine." We walked through without engaging. The implied message seemed to be that people discriminated against here can sympathize with Palestinian people there. I assume there were self-aware people in the group, but I confess to having been baffled. To me, they have it exactly backwards. In fact, gay Palestinians are known to flee the West Bank, where their identity is a death sentence, and they seek asylum in Israel, where there are annual pride parades. In any case, wherever the demonstrators got their information, it probably wasn't the Times of Israel. I walked away thinking that this is what the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the danger of a single story. She teaches that trying to understand complex issues and identities from only one dimension leads to dangerous misunderstandings. If people only know a single story about a subject, they tend to extrapolate from that one point of reference to everything else. It leads to absurd assumptions, such as when her roommate in an American college asked to hear some of her tribal music, and her roommate had a single story about Africans, and Adichie explained that actually English is the official language of Nigeria, and she listens to Mariah Carey. But stories are powerful, and oversimplified single stories are especially seductive. Taking a page out of Adichie's book, I worry that anti-Israel demonstrators, to use her words, are impressionable and vulnerable in the face of a story. In this vein, there is a midrash or rabbinic teaching about the nature of truth. The Hebrew word for truth is emet. Emet is spelled with the first, middle, and last letters of the Hebrew aleph bet, aleph, mem, and taf. Truth, the rabbis teach, is all-encompassing. It takes into account all the other letters and their combinations. The Hebrew word for a lie is sheker. Rabbi Elise Frischman teaches that the word sheker is made up of letters only found at the far end of the aleph bet, shin, kuf, and resh. It leans heavily on one side. Not only that, but the letters are out of order, jumbling the aleph bet sequence. A lie is one-sided and mixed up in the telling. We human beings have a hard time seeing the full picture from aleph to taf, and only God can know the whole truth. People are limited. We have life experience that skews us. We have agendas. We are caught in confirmation bias, stereotypes, echo chambers, and defensiveness. The big picture often makes us feel small. Nevertheless, according to the rabbis, we have a moral obligation to try to get closer to the truth and see as much of the full picture as we can, both the forest and the trees. The Torah, interestingly enough, rarely has just a single story. The story of creation in Genesis 1 is immediately followed by a very different view of creation in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, an infinite God creates the world in 6 days beyond time and space, and then metaphorically comes to rest on the seventh. In Genesis 2, a very down-to-earth God plants a garden and forms Adam from the dust of the earth. Two very different stories. Was God transcendent, above and beyond, or was God immanent, getting God's hands dirty in the soil? The answer, the Torah seems to be saying, is both. God is both far and near. There are also two versions of the Ten Commandments, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. They are mostly the same, but have some significant differences. For instance, in Exodus, we remember Shabbat because God rested on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy, we keep Shabbat because God freed us from Egypt. In honor of both versions, we light 2 different Shabbat candles on Friday night. The rabbis continued this tradition. When one would finish, the next would say davar acher, which means another version. Truth, emet, was achieved by gathering all the commentaries together. I'm worried that we as a society are not following the rabbi's example, but instead perpetuating the dangers of learning only a single story about history and current events. We seem to have lost the ability to hold paradoxical truths and complexity. There is either good or evil, racist or anti-racist, indigenous or colonialist, victim or oppressor. It is easy to fall into a trap of either-or thinking. Today's culture prefers oversimplified single stories, but the truth is often both and, not either or. As the writer G.K. Chesterton wrote, some people live in the immaculate prison of one idea. The stakes are very high when it comes to education in Israel. I am deeply concerned that some of the faculty at our schools are perpetuating a single anti-Israel story to their students. The single story in this case is a fixation on the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. And this story is a very important story. Our hearts break and should break. Palestinian children do not deserve this. Sparing civilian life in war is not only a matter of international law, but is also an issue discussed deeply in Jewish tradition. The problem is not that the story of Palestinian suffering isn't important. It's very important. It's that that story can't be the only story. Palestinian suffering can't be the single exclusive story through which the entire conflict is understood. But this kind of single storytelling contributes to the anti-Semitic situation happening on many college campuses. It feels like too much of the media and too many of our teachers are regurgitating Hamas's propaganda uncritically. We need to be sure to tell Israel's story too, and not just the story of October 7th, but the whole story. I'm a Zionist, and I believe we must never take the state of Israel for granted. If there had been a state of Israel, there would not have been a Holocaust. But more than a refuge, Israel is our homeland and its own creative force in the history of Judaism. The building of Tel Aviv is just as great an accomplishment as the writing of the Talmud. It's miraculous. We must do our best to foster more nuanced discussions about Israel. But first, we have to insist that universities enforce their own codes of conduct. Assemblies with constitutionally protected free speech are one thing. Encampments, staying beyond the time frame of their permits, are another. Wearing masks while chanting Intifada in dormitory lobbies is harassment. Universities should be held legally accountable for enforcing their own rules to create a safe environment for students. Secondly, we need education with context and nuance. When I teach our teenagers at Temple Sinai, I explain that Israel has been faced with impossible choices regarding Gaza. If you say they may never bomb a hospital or a school because that's always a war crime, then you are also saying using human shields and taking hostages work. Hamas will then perpetuate another October 7th. If you say, I'm no military expert, but the IDF shouldn't use bombs and find another way into the bunker, what if there is no other way into the bunker? What if it would cost the lives of dozens of soldiers? And if you say bomb them and know it's Hamas's responsibility for putting them there, then you have to live with the bombing of children, which is horrible. Our hearts cannot become hardened. Things are blurry for the Israeli commander who wants to stop terrorism but not kill innocent people. Civilians can also be hostage takers. Hostages have been found in the homes of journalists, and weapons have been discovered in maternity wards. How is any army supposed to humanely stop terrorism under these conditions? But in avoiding the danger of a single story, we also can't go too far in the other direction. Both sidism is really single storyism in a different guise, where one side is raised up disproportionately. There shouldn't be moral relativity where the IDF and Hamas and Hezbollah become morally the same. They are not. That is untrue and that is unfair. It needs to be said and resaid, especially to the next generation. Hamas wants as much carnage as possible, and the overwhelming majority of Israeli soldiers have conducted themselves admirably and with restraint, full stop. Israel has not bombed indiscriminately, and this is what the hell of war looks like. We cannot allow revisionism and propaganda to have equal footing with the truth. As Deborah Lipstadt taught us, many of us have grown up in the world of the academy and enlightened liberal thought, while we're taught everything is open to debate. But that's not the case. There are facts, there are opinions, and there are lies. I recognize critics might accuse me or other Zionists that our single story is October 7th, and I take that to heart. I admit to be inescapably biased, but I am truly trying to see the big picture. I also wish other communities would struggle over Israeli lives as much as we do over Palestinian lives. Where is the worldwide outrage on behalf of Israelis under bombardment by Hezbollah? It doesn't exist. And if some want to hold Jews, and only Jews, to an impossible standard of warfare, never before achieved by humankind, that's an anti-Semitic double standard. Being a Zionist does not mean being unrealistic about Israel's shortcomings. We can have a both-and view. We can be pro-Israel and be anti-Netanyahu. We can admire Israeli democracy while also acknowledging it's dysfunctional. Thousands of Israelis have been protesting in the streets, but when it is time to come together for self-defense, they do so. We should do the same. The fact that these protests have taken place is to Israel's credit, for no such protests would be tolerated in Iran or other countries in the Middle East. The state of Israel, like the United States, is a work in progress. Just as we in the US are working to create a more perfect union, so is Israel seeking to become the promised land. But Israel has to survive. Everyone says Israel has the right to defend itself, but when they actually do, the critics wring their hands. Israel is not the aggressor. Iran is. We are still absorbing the implications of Iran's recent missile attack and what it might mean. Do not shrug it off. If one of those missiles had gotten through, it would have been catastrophic. 10 million people were in bunkers. I am sure Israel's critics will do their usual reversal of truth and cast Israel as the villain. But that's what they do. The one-sidedness against Israel is crazy-making. I stand with Israel, and I want the next generation to appreciate the complex situation in which Israelis find themselves. Israel needs our unapologetic support now more than ever. It's understandable that good-hearted people want all violence to end immediately. But if you really want to create an opportunity for a different, more peaceful reality, you have to stop the murderers first. Afterwards, we need real education to prevent the indoctrination of the next generation. If we are seekers of truth, we must attempt to see the full picture, similar to Torah study. We need to learn to hold complexity. We must somehow reject the false, judge what is unfair, and hold multiple truths at once. And I hope in the future, when people look back on these days, the full picture will vindicate an embattled Israel imperfectly pursuing a just war. I believe that that should be the victory of history when all of the metaphorical letters come together with all the nuances and details from Aleph to Taf. At Temple Sinai, we have a banner which reads, Temple Sinai supports the people of Israel in their quest for peace. We want to push back on claims that Israelis don't want peace. Ha'emet, the truth is Israel must fight in self-defense, but Israelis crave peace. So do we. Am Yisrael Chai, Od Avinu Chai, Shana Tova.